Our next speaker is a journalist, Wendy Bacon. She's also been an activist for many years. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good to see you here. It's good to see that we don't have any dogs or horses today, because that makes demonstrating... Oh, there's horses over there, are there? Or dogs? Anyway, it's much more pleasant demonstrating without a line of horses behind us. Now, some people have said that it wasn't really necessary to go on demonstrating at the moment because nothing has happened since we met here in December. Now, lots has happened since we met here in December. As the chairperson just said, first of all, Twitter has been demanded by the US government, the subpoenas issued to hand up all the private details of certain people, including Julian Assange, the politician in Sweden, all their, in Iceland, all their personal details from Twitter. So that is one thing that's happened. Another thing that's happened since we met last is that in Afghanistan, drones, which are the most frightening instruments of war, drones have continued to kill people over the Pakistan border. We're told they're always Taliban, but of course, as we know from Wikileaks, we simply cannot possibly accept that at face value, and we have to know that there are almost certainly innocent people being killed by these drones every day. Another thing that's happened, and I'd like to start by focusing on that, is that Bradley Manning is still being held in solitary confinement. Bradley Manning is the most important person in this whole saga. And another thing that's happened is that the people who committed murder by shooting innocent people in Iraq from an Apache helicopter have still not been charged with a criminal offence. Now, if we look at that, I'm focusing again on that video because it's one of the key things that Manning allegedly leaked, and something that I think focuses the issues very clearly. First of all, there's at least 3 major war crimes, according to the Geneva Convention, revealed on that video. What was Bradley Manning meant to do when he came in possession of that video? If we are to believe the emails, and again, you know, who knows, but if we are to believe the emails of his correspondent with the person who finally put him in, he agonised about that. He had tried to complain about the shooting of innocent people, the locking up of innocent people in Iraq. So what was he to do? In fact, if he had not acted, he would have been guilty himself, potentially guilty of a conspiracy. Now let's just focus on Bradley Manning and where he is today. He's now been 5 months in solitary confinement. Julian Assange, having been in solitary confinement himself, said that he has now a glimmer, and of course we'd have to be there to know it, and he has been. Also, Wikileaks have supported Bradley Manning with some donations in recent weeks, but Bradley Manning is still there in solitary confinement. He has the light on all day. Can you imagine that? He is not able to read at certain times of the day. He only has one friend, apart from his lawyers and health professionals who are able to visit him. So he should be a really big focus of our campaign here. Now, just in the last few days, the UN rapporteur on torture has had this to say. The allegations that this person is in some form of solitary confinement is by itself a matter of concern, because solitary confinement by itself can, at least in some instances, cause very serious psychological harm. It is in itself a form of torture. The people who want to shut down Wikileaks actively support and use torture. The only possible purpose of that is to break the will of Bradley Manning for some purpose, for some unjust purpose. And I would agree with Mike Moore and Daniel Ellsberg when they have called Bradley Manning a hero of freedom of information in our age. Next, I'd like to focus. Sorry. Next, I'd like to focus. Sorry, is that screeching bit? Next, I'd like to focus briefly on some of the arguments that are used by our politicians against WikiLeaks. And Daniel Ellsberg has had something about these to say, because he experienced exactly the same arguments when he released the Pentagon Papers way back in the early 1970s. And exactly those arguments were used. We're told that WikiLeaks is interfering with diplomatic relationships. Diplomatic relationships, I would say, which are dishonest, duplicitous relationships. He's producing embarrassing things that can damage our relations with other countries, and he's endangering people's lives. Now, these are stock standard arguments that are put out time and time again. The people who use them are not interested in the facts. They're not interested in what is actually happening. And as Ellsberg said, they were used against him. But yesterday I thought, I'll just go back. Now, I know this is way back beyond, when some of you were even born, but back in 1984 I was working in an Australian newspaper called the National Times. And our editor then, Brian Toohey, who's still a journalist, got a huge leak of ASIO documents. Now, these were not American documents, they were our own Australian documents. One of these documents showed that the Secretary of State of the United States, George Shultz, had actually dictated a press release which announced a shift in policy allowing nuclear ships to visit Australia. And at the time, without even hesitating, the Hawke Labor government went immediately to the High Court and used every single one of those arguments, asking for the closing down of the publication of those documents. And Brian Toohey was at the time asked to present to the court every single document in his possession which had anything to do with foreign policy. It's almost like a rerun of the same arguments we're hearing now. Now, I'd like to also focus on just a little bit the situation of Julian Assange. Julian Assange, and I think it's very important that people spread this word out, Julian Assange is not being charged yet with those sexual assaults. But what's more, he is prepared to be questioned. And what came out very clearly after the bail hearing this week is that, in fact, the Swedish government, the Swedish lawyers, have been invited to go to London and actually conduct an interview with him. Not only that, if they don't choose to do that, he's prepared to do that interview by video link. Every day in our courts in Australia and throughout the world, people are held in prison and have to appear through video link. But somehow an interview with an uncharged person cannot be done by video link. And that alone exposes that these charges are being used for a political purpose to get Julian Assange into Sweden for purposes which are to do with WikiLeaks. So I think that while we, the people here, in a sense, are preaching to the converted, I think it's very important that all these arguments we challenge. Now I'd like to mention just briefly the situation in Tunisia, where in the last 48 hours the President of Tunisia, a long-term dictator in the name of democracy, has had to flee. And some people have said, and I think it is clearly an overstatement, that this is the first WikiLeaks revolution. That's clearly not true. The people of Tunisia had these grievances, knew about the reality of their daily lives long before the WikiLeaks cables on Tunisia were released. But what these cables did reveal to the people in Tunisia, that all along the American government, which is so keen on the military links with these countries, with Tunisia and other countries in the Middle East, all along they've known exactly the injustices and the corruption going on in Tunisia. And I'd like to point out that the response of the US diplomat in these cables was not to call for the truth to come out. Oh no. What they were calling for, and it's clearly in words in the cables, that they wanted to mute their public criticism. They didn't want to bring these things out into the open. No, they wanted to privately express them, but publicly make them secret. And that, I think, goes to the very heart of what WikiLeaks is about. Now, at the end of the day, there are the principles about whistleblowing, about freedom of information, which are at the heart of the WikiLeaks scenario. However, it's also important in the coming months, because this is going to be a long campaign, that we do focus on the content of the cables themselves. And just to mention one Australian cable, it is revealed in the cables, as the Sydney Morning Herald has reported, that in Afghanistan, the Australian military machine were pushing for a tougher line than the Dutch troops. They were critical of the Dutch troops because they were more interested in reconstruction than aggressive military action. Now that alone would justify the publication of the Australian WikiLeaks documents. We need to know what our government is doing in Afghanistan on our behalf. So I will just finish there by saying that it's not about diplomacy. This is about duplicity, it's about lies, not only the lies we're being told every day, but also the lies that are being told to justify the oppression of WikiLeaks. Thank you. So that is one thing that's happened. Another thing that's happened since we met last is that in Afghanistan, drones, which are the most frightening instruments of war, drones have continued to kill people over the Pakistan border. We're told that always, and some people have said that it wasn't really necessary to go on demonstrating at the moment because nothing has happened since we met here in December. Now, lots has happened since we met here in December. As the chairperson just said, first of all, Twitter has been demanded by the US government, the subpoenas issued to hand up all the private details of certain people, including Julian Assange, the politician in Sweden, in Iceland, all their personal details from Twitter. It's good to see that we don't have any dogs or horses today, because that makes demonstrating. Oh, there's horses over there, are there? Or dogs? Anyway, it's much more pleasant demonstrating without a line of horses behind us.
Our next speaker is a journalist, Wendy Bacon. She's also been an activist for many years. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good to see you here.